Welcome, everyone, to the panel on non-linear narratives. I'm glad you made your way through the windy hallways at the Renaissance Hotel that we are gathered in. We were very much tempted to begin this panel by saying, well, panelists, do you have any closing thoughts? We're running out of time here, but we were afraid that you would all leave. So we're not going to make this a non-linear panel. We're not going to begin with closing thoughts and end with introductions. Instead, we're going to order the panel in the normal way and begin with the introduction. So I'm going to call on people as they appear on my screen to let you know who we've got here. Arkady, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I'm Arkady Martine. I write science fiction, fantasy, and occasionally horror. My most recent book is called A Desolation Called Peace, which came out in March. And it is the sequel to A Memory Called Empire, which won the Hugo last year, which I'm supposed to mention all the time.
Woohoo, yes, you are.
I'm excited about this panel.
And Ada.
Hi, I'm Ada Palmer. I'm a historian, and I look at a lot of historical literature, so I'm eager to talk about nonlinear narrative in pre-modern stuff. And I am the author of the Terra Ignota books, including Two Like the Lightning, which, much like Memory Called Empire, is a Compton Crook winner, which is a very important Balticon tradition. And I'm also working on a new series, which is about Viking mythology, which also uses a lot of nonlinear narrative.
And Nick.
I'm Nick Mamatas. I'm an author, editor, and anthologist, and I wrote a very unsuccessful nonlinear narrative novel called Bullet Time, which involves the same person in 3 different timelines, all in the first person, being observed by himself in sort of beyond space and time, also in the first person, and it made the world's worst audiobook for reasons obvious to everyone. And that's why I'm here.
And Daniel.
Hi, I'm Daniel Ford. I am a fantasy and mystery novelist. I wrote the Paladin trilogy and the Jack Dixon mysteries. My next series is called The Warden, and I'm really excited to be here.
And I'm Scott Edelman, published more than 100 stories in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And I'm the host of the Eating the Fantastic podcast, 145 episodes so far, where I take writers out for meals and discuss their secret origins and how they came to be. But we are here to discuss the non-narrative aspect of the narrative arts. I'm going to begin with a quote from Jean-Luc Godard, who said, "I agree, a film should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order." And the people who have gathered here together are people who have both committed nonlinear narratives and are fascinated by the nonlinear narratives of others. Any questions you have, put it in the Q&A. Keep chatting amongst yourselves. I'll keep an eye on that, and we'll get to talking on some of those eventually. But what I would first like to toss out there is, why do people do this? What is the point of this? What does it accomplish? I think that's a good start before we get into examples. What is the point of taking a narrative, breaking into little pieces and shaking it up in a bag and putting it out elsewhere? Well, Ada, why don't you take us into the subject?
I think lots of different reasons, so we can each discuss different ones. One of them is that you get very different emotional weight and connection with the reader when something is coming and the reader knows that it's coming. And in that sense, you can compare some methods of nonlinear storytelling to genre promises or bits where you're telling a familiar tale. So if you go, if you're Shakespeare's audience and it says comedy on the playbill, you know basically how this is going to end. And if you're heading in and it says the tragedy of, you also know basically how it's going to end. And when it's tragedy of, you're in meta suspense of how are these people going to die? You know these people are going to die. In which order are they going to die? They're going to die like this, they're going to die like that. And you have a completely different relationship with the story than when you don't know that a particular thing is going to happen. And one thing that humans find very satisfying is the satisfying completion of a thing that we know is coming. That's why we like hearing versions of stories we've heard before. It's key to music. You want it to come back to the chord you expect to be at the end. It's key to a lot of the most formulaic forms of writing. So cozy mystery, where there can be variation, but you know at the end that the detective has to gather everybody in the accusing parlor and then go through all of their secrets one by one and do the murderer last. And like a gymnastics routine where we're excited to see the performer do a thing we know is coming, but do it excellently. Humans like to see a thing that we know is coming performed excellently and performed powerfully. And nonlinear narrative or nonlinear revelation, which isn't necessarily quite different, can do that. And I'll give one example, and then I want to hear other people talk about other kinds of nonlinear narrative. But the core of Homer's Iliad is that you know what's going to happen. You know Troy is going to fall. You know how this is going to end. You know it's when he doesn't bother to give you the ending. It's not in there. The Trojan horse is not in the Iliad. And the emotional heart of this are the death of Patroclus and the death of Hector. And Homer tells you over and over, Patroclus is going to die. The first time you meet Patroclus, he's going to die. The fates, he's going to die. The gods are going to argue about how he's going to die. He's going to die. And then after you know he's going to die, then Homer makes you fall in love with him. And then you watch him die, and it's so much more emotionally intense than if you didn't know already where this is heading. And so this kind of emotional intensity, the anguish of, oh no, I'm trying not to love this person, they're gonna die, and now I love them and they're gonna die. That's one of many things that nonlinear revelation can accomplish, is that it can accomplish very powerful and different emotional connections between the reader and what's happening, like a more solid, more inexorable version of foreshadowing, which therefore can amplify tension, grief, elation, suspense. How is it going to happen? Etc.
Arkady, what about you?
So I kind of want to leap off from that and think about ways in which taking a linear narrative when an expectation of what is going to happen has been built up, and perhaps even one in which the reader has been told how it happens, and then telling it in the wrong order. And thinking about, for me, what this allows the author to do is to curate a specific set of emotional experiences or thematic images for the reader. That the reader who has got the plot kind of squared away in the back of their mind has a kind of freedom to experience a series of revelations and a series of connections which may not be linked for the characters because they are not happening in the expected linear order, but are clearly linked for the reader and for the author. For me, I often find in my own work, when I do sort of nonlinear formalist pieces, I'm often thinking about not just having theme be a strong aspect of the work, but having theme be and imagery, which to me are very close together, be the thread that moves from one scene to another, the connecting rope. So that's one thing you can do.
How about you, Nick?
Well, the question sort of implies that, of course, we would write things in chronological order or linear order, but then some people, for some bizarre reason, don't do that. I suggest that it's just as much a choice to make a linear story than it is a nonlinear story. In that when we live our lives, we don't live narratives. We hammer narratives into our lives as we're living them. So we experience things non-linearly in a lot of ways already. And when the novel was being formulated, like the English novel was being formulated, at first there were some thoughts like, why would somebody write a story this long? So a lot of early novels were, oh, I was walking around in the attic and I found this box, and inside this box was a journal. Let's read this journal, and that's the story. Or look at this collection of letters from these various people. Let's put them together in some order. And then you ended up with Stern doing Tristram Shandy, which was a 9-volume novel that purports to be the memoir of the title character, Tristram Shandy, and he appears in volume 3. That's when he's born. So the first 2 volumes of his memoir, he's not in it. And that's an early English novel. And when the novel was sort of a new thing and being formulated. There was no particular reason to have either this kind of ossified epistolary style or a totally bizarre style. I mean, even to this day, most people aren't following Tristram structures, but it was still incredibly influential. Or doing what we now see in the 20th and 21st century novel, where we are accepting this idea of a character who is either telling us a story or that we're riding around on their shoulder or inside their brain, experiencing their story. So these are all equal choices. It's not as though nonlinear is a choice that is made for sneaky reasons. Well, of course it should be linear, or of course the expectation is linear. So ultimately, why not?
Yeah, Daniel?
Sometimes it can be really funny. If two characters are having a conversation and one knows what the conversation is and the other doesn't because they're experiencing time at different rates, or they're having the wrong end of the conversation, or they're coming at it from the wrong sides, it can just be hilarious. I'm thinking of the British sci-fi sitcom Red Dwarf that plays with time a lot and has a lot of episodes where that exact scenario happens, where one character doesn't realize what the conversation they had in the beginning of the episode means until the end of the episode, right? And then the joke works as a callback. It worked in the first scene, and then it works as a callback again at the end. Right.
The Memory of Lisa Yates episode is an amazing nonlinear storytelling craftsmanship piece, as is Whitehall. Yeah. Red Dwarf did very cool stuff with structure.
Yeah, and Nick is correct about there is no reason anything has to be in what we perceive as a narrative from past to future. It is unfortunate, well, not unfortunately, it has become, I think, what's seen as the default narrative that people are taught, and anything beyond that is something that's a choice, whereas the other is a choice that we have been given by the society of writers that we end up reading. So I think too many people just go to it naturally. But well, an additional reason I just want to point out that I think we mess with time is to keep hidden from the reader or from the viewer things that they don't know are hidden from the reader or the viewer. And I think of, again, I'm going to TV, but I'm going to the episode Walkabout in Lost, for those who watched Lost, when we discover that when the character, I'm going to do a spoiler here, so if you don't want to hear a spoiler for Lost, a TV show from 20 years ago, you can skip it next minute. But when we first meet, Locke, he jumps up and runs around and is doing all sorts of things. We don't know until 4 episodes in that when he came to the island, he was unable to walk and had to be carried onto the plane. If we had seen that in the narrative order that had been, that time gives us, the moment of realization would not be something that we went, oh, what was that? Wait, have they been cheating? Did they cheat this whole episode? So it had much more power as a revealed fact, knowing it.
There's a subtler type of nonlinear revelation that many books do, and many books can do, but that people don't tend to think about, which is whenever you have a text that is first person but is an artifact, right? The book is the diary of something, or the book is a history being written later, or the book is a memoir, or someone looking back. The character at the moment that they're writing it is in a different, later in the timeline moment than the events that they're describing, and they know more things. And so that person can reveal or not reveal stuff. And what that character chooses to put in is an entirely separate timeline that is parallel to the timeline of the events. For Terra Ignota, I have a calendar which not only has the events, but it also has the point at which each chapter of book 1 was being written during book 3. So I'm keeping track of, while writing this chapter, is the character happy? Is the character grieving? Is the character upset? Which affects the tone. And that can be subtle things like tone, but it can also be utterly reader experience transforming things. So exactly, the Gene Wolfe is the example I was going to bring up, how very early in the Book of the New Sun, early in the first book, Shadow of the Torturer, the narrator very casually mentions that he ends up on the throne. And from that moment, the entire experience of the narrative pivots around, wait a minute, this is eventually landing you on the throne. That doesn't sound plausible from where we are. Wow, what do we advance to? How do we get there? And the whole rest of the story is you following it with that question dominating every bit of thinking that you're doing. And so then when the narrator also makes the choice to skip some events, skip over things, you wonder, okay, why did he skip that? You know, he just jumped over an evening or jumped over a journey or didn't tell me the end of a battle, some of which is modeled on Tristram Shandy, which was a great example to bring up because it's an exploration of interruption. And Diderot Jacques Le Fataliste is another, where Diderot will be telling you a story, and then in the most extreme version of this I've ever run across, the characters go to bed, and Diderot says, while we wait for them to wake up, I'll tell you this other story. And then starts telling you a completely other unrelated story, and then says, actually, I'm tired. I'm gonna lie down in the bed next to theirs. And then the chapter ends. In the next chapter, everyone's gotten up in the morning, we're back in the regular story. Just wait, no, that isn't how it works, Diderot. You're not in the same reality that they are. What just happened? But he can be if he wants to be. So those layers of the narrator and the narration is an important nonlinear revelatory tool.
One of the things that interests me about that is something that shows up a lot in a genre that we often think is very straightforward, which is the first-person detective noir. First-person detective noir often is told in a strictly linear manner with some revelations held back for the reader to put together and then get confirmed. So in that sense, it's much like other mysteries. But the detective has a very distinct voice, and that voice is present throughout the entire process of relaying information or not doing so. And in noir and some of noir's antecedents, and I'm thinking of the work of Taina French here, who is not really writing in the tradition of noir, but who I think is quite linked to some of the place-based aspects of noir. The unreliability of the first-person narrator, who is only explaining what happened with a very particular gloss, and whether that narrator even knows that they're doing it is a question that the reader gets to think about the entire way through. And also makes revelations like mistakes that the character has made that they didn't know were mistakes interesting as to when they choose to reveal those, with the assumption, as Ada mentioned, that this character has to be telling the story at some point. So they are capable of making choices.
Or you can think of that very classic noir voiceover of the, you know, I should have known when she walked through the door that this woman would be the, you know, the death of my family or whatever, that they'll do the out of order narration.
Well, anytime anyone said, had I but known, that's
Mhm.
sort of doing the same thing. You're speaking from the future. But now, how do we make sure that as a writer, we're doing this for the right reasons? Because one of the things we often say to beginning writers, one of the flaw that often a beginning writer might do is they've written a story and say, oh, wait, I've got to start with this period of action because you've got to get that reader in with this action scene, and then I will go back. And they often that ends up getting done because the writer hasn't figured out the correct way to tell the story, and therefore has pulled something from the middle, shoved it in the front to draw you in. That often, I mean, I started out in comics, and that is something that is a comic book trope, and it always was. You had a big splash page at the beginning, and then you explain how they got there. That happens all the time. How, when we choose to do this, because you could take any story and move it around, how do you make sure it's done for the correct reasons to make it a better reading experience and a deeper, richer one? I don't know who wants to jump on that one first. I think Nick is waving his hand there.
Yeah. I deal with that a lot when teaching writing. Invariably, I get one per class where someone has heard, oh, it started with a hook, and they create a false hook of some sort, and then comes up with somebody alone thinking about some more interesting event. And I keep saying, why aren't we just at that event? And I think the issue is really the influence of movies and cinema. Because not only is it a comic book trope, it is definitely a movie trope. And
I call that a Bond film opening, when you open with an action sequence that will then end and have nothing to do with what's coming next.
Exactly. And horror films do this like, because you want the blood spray right away. And then, oh, 3 years earlier at the mental hospital or in the suburb, nothing happens for 25 minutes. And I mean, on some level, the TV and movies have had huge influences, huge positive influences on writing. The 20th century novel has many more flashbacks than the 19th century novel does because flashbacks were in films.
Mhm.
And people like Charles Jackson, who wrote The Lost Weekend, re-innovated the flashback in these ways. But ultimately, it just comes down to people not reading enough and not understanding how point of view works. As the others were saying, a first-person narrator in the past tense not only knows how the story turns out they're going to tell, something at the end of that event makes them want to tell that story. So there should be some sort of, most often, some kind of logical hint as to, hey, you at this bar stool or reading this paper or somehow receiving my message, here, I've got a story for you, and let me tell you it. So we make that promise early on. But ultimately, I think the televisual imagination has really influenced beginning writers poorly, and they watch far too much TV and don't read enough books, whether they are nonlinear books or linear books. So ultimately, the issue is, how do we tell, when we ask a beginning writer, why did you do this? We should ask them, is this because you like movies more than books? Do you want to be a filmmaker, but filmmaking is expensive and books are cheap to write? And then kind of sort of approach it on that
The
level.
answer I get when I teach writing, and I ask that question because I run into the same problem,
Yeah.
is I want to get published,
Right. Mm-hmm.
which is, I mean, I definitely see the influence of film in both long form and short form in the structuring of the exciting, inciting incident, and then a lot of backstory until we can hook the two threads up again. But I think the reason that a lot of beginning writers tend to gravitate toward precisely that structure is that they have absorbed the often untrue writing advice that you must start with something exciting.
Yes.
Even if your story doesn't need it, or that should be the end.
Right.
Mhm.
Or you just should start there and then keep going.
Which means
You want-
sometimes I've found that one of the more efficacious ways when a student hasn't absorbed that bad lesson is to point out, this is a Bond film opening, and notice the first time you usually actually smile while watching a Bond film is after that's over, when he's talking to Q. And when two actual characters are actually having a conversation and having personality, that's when you feel warm and start being connected to the narrative. Put that first. If you don't have giant explosion visuals, cut ahead to the part that actually grips the reader, which is not the action sequence, it's the characterization.
Yeah.
And that kind of way of putting it often works.
Now, you who are teachers, do you get the correct response from these students when you tell them this? Do they get it and receive this wisdom?
Almost never, but that's fine.
Sometimes, but depends very much on how strong the student's response of I want to get published was. If it's I want to get published and therefore I've done this and I hated doing it, they very quickly discard the thing they didn't like. If it's I want to get published and I will follow any advice that someone has ever said that seems to lead towards publication, no, they're never going to listen to me.
Now, Daniel,
Yeah,
where do you weigh in on this of the avoidance of doing it wrong, or just pulling the guts of an action scene out of the middle and shoving it in front, which is what we often end up seeing when it's just done gratuitously?
My day job is teaching writing, academic writing to high school seniors in a college prep school. And one thing I constantly tell them, and I think it would apply when I've taught creative writing too, is just say the thing. I don't need you to clear your throat, right? Just say the thing. If you take one thing out of my composition class, stop clearing your throat at the beginning of the paper and just say the thing. Right. So if what I need to know about this character, and now I realize my second PI noir novel started precisely with a James Bond scene like you just described, but at least it was the second book, not the first one. If what I need to know about the character is something that's going to be revealed in an action scene, right, it should have consequences for the character and for the narrative. And if your opening scene doesn't have like consequences, because you just wanted an exciting scene, that's not a good reason to have an exciting scene, right? Just because you want to have this scene isn't necessarily the reason to do it, right? It has to mean something. And if you're just throwing it in there because somebody told you that that's how to get published, it's probably not the greatest piece of advice, right? But yeah, I don't stop clearing your throat. Just say the thing. If my students learn one thing from me, that's what I want it to be.
Yeah, ultimately, you want the first bit of the story to tantalize the reader, not necessarily hook the reader. Right? When people say hook, they think excitement, explosion, death, blood, cursing, fucking. But tantalizing can be done via language, via an image, via a question. And if you must have an exciting scene at the beginning that isn't from the beginning of the story, for the love of God, don't call it the prologue, right? Before, logos, word, before the word, not somewhere between chapter 5 and 6, but first. You know, that is in fantasy, that is the tell. When the prologue is not prologos at all, that's when we know they've not actually finished their book.
A good way to think about it is how much order of revelation can shift what is at stake in a scene and what the reader is in suspense about. And a lot of the times you might have, a sequence that has to happen, but you might realize that the suspense as to whether X will succeed or fail isn't actually suspenseful, right? So let's say it's the middle of the book and the thing is going to destroy the entire Earth. No one's really in suspense as to whether that's going to occur in the middle of the book. It can. You have to have the rest of the thing, and unless you have some other planet for them to be on or something, it's not going to. But the suspense in that sequence can be like, which of two rivals succeeds in saving the Earth? Or do they save the Earth with honor? Or do they have to resort to something dishonorable? The stake isn't necessarily whether the main event is going to happen. And you can use out of order revelation to shift and even create moments of suspense or tension in a scene that otherwise is difficult. Because sometimes you have a character death that's going to happen. And it's pretty obvious that that character death has to happen. And it's not necessarily going to be possible to make the reader be in suspense about that character death. And when you realize that, you're like, okay, I'm going to have them find out before the character death happens that the character is going to die by having the narrator say it in advance. And then you're in suspense as to how, which is a more interesting suspense than, oh, I bet this character is going to die, where you feel different about it. And so, or out of order revelation can make the stakes of something be, did they get the message before they died? Did they get to kiss one last time before they died? What was the tension can be a different thing that the reader can be in genuine doubt about, even as other things may be sort of inexorably locked in or predictable.
Yeah, are there any tips for avoiding that? We mentioned the pitfall of shoving the action up front, and we have a question here about what other pitfalls are there that you got to avoid when doing a novel out of order. As you mentioned, when you already know the future and the past, what tips are there for dribbling out that information in such a way that the person still cares about it as they read forward?
There does have to be some kind of structure to the novel, even if it is not in any way a linear one. There has to be a reason for the author to have chosen to put these scenes in this order, or the author via the point of view character to have put these scenes in this order. And I think with a nonlinear work, and I speak from my own experience here, you have to do a lot more preparation than you necessarily would in a linear work. Some people do a ton of preparation anyway. When I write linearly, I don't really. But if I'm going to write non-linearly, I have to know what I'm putting in the wrong quote unquote order. So I have to know what that order would be if I had started in straightforward, or have a sense of what the thematic beats or cycle that I'm using a nonlinear narrative to evoke is going to be. Even if that's as simple as I'm going to alternate every scene between the point of view of the person in the year 2100 and the point of view of the person in the year 2300.
Anyone else have tips on that? How not to
The
mess it
structure
up?
should fit the theme. The structure should fit the theme. So if one's theme is about how decisions that characters make can influence different realities, it makes perfect sense to have a nonlinear system where you can have the outcome be seen from different points of view or from different years. If it is about, especially in science fiction, when time can be fluid, not just as a narrative conceit, but as the actual mimesis of the story. Sure, why not have it non-linear if you have a time travel story? Or if it is a theme exploring consciousness, where we don't think linearly. If you ask somebody to tell an anecdote, they very rarely going to, unless they've rehearsed it, are going to give you a linear story anyway. So if it fits the theme, then sure, do it, and that theme will imply a structure.
Yeah, I think often you either need to have an in-narrative reason that it's happening, right? That your character is experiencing out of time, or your character is writing it in this particular way because it flatters them, or the documents arrived at a particular time. You either need that, or if you don't need that, you just are having the bits of information come in out of order. You can get away with that, but it has to really click at the end. And there has to really be that payoff in that moment. I refer to this as a puzzle box structure, where when everything comes together at the end, the reader goes, ah, and there's this moment of like, yes, it all came together, and all of the reasons that it was out of order I now see, which sometimes can happen in a very simple story. I'm not much of a watcher of sitcoms, but the British sitcom Coupling has extremely ornate and well done puzzle box structure writing in many of its episodes, in which it does non-linear or jumpy backy forthy thing, and over does this sort of at the end. And another really good example of that is the X-Files episode Jose Chung's From Outer Space, where there is an in narrative reason for the out of order as well, but you can get away with it so long as you do so with this sort of beautifully stuck the landing, did a triple axel at the end, boom, it landed, and everyone's, that was worth it. If it's not going to have such a conspicuous payoff, that's when it can feel weird unless there was an in-world reason for it. I mean, ideally, you're going to have both kinds of payoff. There's an in-world reason, and there's still that's the moment at which it clicked. But I think you have to make it click more if you didn't have an in-narrative reason for the out of order. Does that feel right to others?
Yeah. Well, why don't we, I'd like to hear from people. Let's get personal now. I would like to hear people talk about a time they did an out of order story narratively, and the reason they did it and what they felt it brought to the story, why they did it. I'll just, to give you a moment to think, I'll just mention I have a story that came out last year, which was a non-supernatural horror story called Only Bruises Are Permanent. And the first sentence was something like, before she pushed her boyfriend out before she broke her boyfriend's arm, but well, after she broke her boyfriend's arm, but before she pushed him out the window, this thing happened. And then we have this scene, and the purpose of this, to my mind, of doing this in the story, was that you were aware that this protagonist was not going to put up with what was occurring later that you see her undergoing. Meaning, if it's a story and you have someone who's being put upon by someone in a relationship, you might say, I don't want to deal with this anymore. But my feeling was that by doing this out of order and indicating what she did after the things that she did, you would hang on to see, okay, he's going to get his, and I'm going to hang on until he does. So that was the reason I decided that if it was done in order, I felt you would lose something about, well, I'm not going to hang out this because obviously this is not going to go well for her. I want you to know it's not going to go well for him. But anyway, having given it that time, well, Daniel, do you have a specific story that you did? And what were the reasons you did it? What did it bring to the story?
I've done it a few times. In my second TI novel, Cheap Heat, there's a moment where sort of Jack Dixon, the main character who's narrating everything, figures out figures out the mystery. And he says, I got to go make 2 phone calls. And then we flash forward to him going and taking care of business. And the reader doesn't know who it is he called until they sort of show up and save the day, right? And that was to maintain suspense, right? That was to maintain suspense so Jack could get in over his head and somebody could come and ride to the rescue. I did it also, I have an entire 4-book series I've planned and written about a book and a half of that's all in nonlinear time. that hopefully will see the light of day sometime. It's a sequel series to my first trilogy, which was in a large part about how, what happens when you're trying to bring a new religion into the world. And in this, in the sequel series, some of it takes place where the main characters, and it's a different protagonist in all three books, because I really wanted to make it hard on myself. The first three books all narrated by someone different. When they're like 10 years old, the first chapter is when they're 50, and the second chapter is when they're 10. And it keeps going back and forth until eventually the 10-year-old catches up with where the 40 or 50-year-old was at the start of the book. And what I wanted to show what happens when the patriarchs and matriarchs of a religion who had the direct experience of the divine, they're gone now. They're not around anymore. So how do the people around them, how does this start to fall apart? So you see them when they're 10 and they're 12 and they're 15 and they're being brought up in this church, and they're totally on board. And then when they're adults now, they're not anymore. What happens as it starts to fall apart because that experience isn't there anymore? And I wanted to preserve again, sort of bring the reader along without telling them directly. And I guess, like I said, I just wanted to make it harder on myself by telling it that way. Probably not the best motive for it. Don't make it harder on yourself, kids. Terrible idea.
Yes, and how have you committed non-narrative structure, Arkady?
So I think probably the clearest example in something that's published, there's two and they're both weird. So I do this when I get into working with historical stuff, because somehow that lends itself. Just last week, there's a new magazine called The Deadlands, which reprinted a story of mine called Fear, Death by Water, which is an obvious reference to T.S. Eliot, and is simultaneously, it's a short story, it's like 2,000 words long or something. I don't know if it would have worked at any longer length than that. It's simultaneously T.S. Eliot's The Four Quartets and The Death of Caesar, with a lot of references to Suetonius and like all kinds of other fun stuff. And it's in space because why not? But I told it completely out of order. And it starts with the end and ends with the end. It's a loop, it goes around like a wheel. And I did it that way because I was using narratives which I expected my audience to have a minor or major familiarity with. And I wanted to defamiliarize them in some ways and point out the bits of those narratives that I was particularly interested in. And also to, in that sense, start with an image and then recontextualize that image at the end of the story, having revealed a sequence of information. So that was a lot of fun. In terms of longer form things, the novella I'm about to finish right now is a locked room murder mystery. So there's some of the standard murder mystery, achronic revelation of information in it, including a version of the then I made 2 phone calls. There's the she went out and did a necessary errand. End of scene. But that, I don't think of that as nonlinear so much as information control. And that's for the reader more than for the characters.
Ada, how about an example of your choosing to be nonlinear and why you did it, what the purpose in the narrative was for doing it?
So there's a lot of it coming out in October in the final volume, but an example from the first volume, but this is also in the sphere of what Arkady is calling information control. In the first book of Terra Ignota, in the first paragraph, the narrator tells you that he begs your leave to let you trust him for a little while, since the narrative will give you time enough to hate him in its own right. And he makes it clear that his name, if you recognize it, is likely to make you want to stop reading. And very rapidly in the beginning, we learn he's a convict. And we don't get anything else about that for a while, but it means that through all of the subsequent chapters, the reader is wondering what is it about this person? Why is this person infamous? What did they do? Why are they convict? Am I expected to hate them for the thing they already did or for a thing that they're going to do? And it strongly colors your thoughts and also makes you pay extra attention to subtle details that feel like they might be hints of that. So it affects the information retention that the reader has for the things that the narrator mentions, or ways people respond to or act toward the narrator when they know who it is, as opposed to when they don't know the name of the person, that affects what the reader remembers from a scene. So that if that's never mentioned in, say, chapter 3, but you read chapter 3 differently when you're thinking about, am I looking for evidence of what it is that the convict did? So that exact type of out of order information revelation is a tool. And then minimizing spoilers to some extent, there are points at which the narrator, who is not well mentally, can't tell himself the order that things are happening in, and will conflate two moments and think that this was the same conversation, but it was a different conversation, or suddenly mix up where he is and believe that he's 17 years ago and these things are still happening that weren't. And you, the reader, gradually come to realize how to track on when this narrator's insanity is making his capacity to track on time and his capacity to track on order of events mess up, so that he's plunging you temporarily into the past, or so that he's blurred together two things that happened on several different days into one day because he couldn't keep track of it. But you can. And it's a interesting manner in which, as we think about it, out of order revelation and having an unreliable narrator are very intertwined, in that having an unreliable narrator generally is out of order revelation, because it's realizing something either before or after the character has told you something that contradicts it. And there's a lot of overlap and a lot of intertwining of nonlinear revelation of information, which may or may not be nonlinear presentation of scenes. Overlaps a lot with having a unreliable narrative.
Nick, you mentioned bullet time earlier, so tell me a bit about the choices for why the story was told that way, what you were doing.
It's thematic reasons. It's about a school shooting, or a kid who decides to shoot up a school. He is sort of compelled to do so to a certain extent by Edis, the goddess of discord. And we go through 3 different timelines. One where he does it, he kills a bunch of other kids and he goes to prison. One where he tries and fails, can't even shoot up a school, right? So he just sort of runs away and lives a weird little life. And one where he resists the temptation to shoot up his school and also lives sort of a miserable little life. And I was interested in, I mean, every decision we all make is irreversible. We can't really reverse a decision, but some decisions are more irreversible than others, and they limit the subsequent decisions we can make. So I was highly interested in that, and highly interested in how someone could possibly escape their own decisions. And so thematically, it made sense to have 3 different timelines, and then a 4th timeline from the same person beyond space and time with unlimited information, but no ability to act. So it was like a philosophical thematic sort of thing. And one other thing I was involved with early on was the concept for which eventually became the film Edge of Tomorrow, which is about Tom Cruise dying over and over again until he wins the war, like a video game. And I wrote the treatment that was sold to the guy who wrote the first script that was thrown out when Tom Cruise got in, but some little thing survived. And when some little thing survived was the concept is he keeps going back to the same start point, like a video game. But of course, if you did that in a film, the film would be 7 hours long. So you have to find certain places where to cut. You have to create other little bits of interesting points where we cut back to that instead, with the understanding that, of course, we did go back all the way to the beginning, but we're not showing that because that would be tedious. And so that's just on the practical level. That's where nonlinear narrative is actually more practical than chronological narrative, because the chronological narrative in that film would have been months long.
Yeah, well, with the 5 minutes left, let me jump on a couple more of these questions. Someone wants to know do we have any thoughts on when you have a story told with two alternating threads and you realize at the end that the end of one is really the beginning of the other? They were not occupying, I guess, the same time or space. Anyone have one thing to say about that?
Monica Burns' novel, Girl on the Road, does that. And it's extremely interesting. It's also extremely interesting because it's two first-person apostrophes. Right, a first-person apostrophe is when a first-person I speak to a you who isn't the reader, but is another character who's absent. And so the two first-person people are talking to the other absent first person. And there are problems with the novel, with concepts and things like that and weird characterizations, but formally, it's probably one of the most amazing novels I've ever read. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, as an example of a stellar formalist experiment, Monica Burns' Girl on the Road is the one I'd recommend.
Yeah, and there's one other question before we'll get to where you only have a couple of minutes left here. When you have a TV series and all of a sudden in the final episode, we have this big flashback, do we consider that to be an actual example of nonlinear narrative? Or is that just a linear thing with a flashback thrown in at the end to answer questions?
I think it's a recontextualization rather than strictly nonlinear, mostly because it only occurs once. If you do it more than once in the course of an episode, that I would definitely say is nonlinear. And people were talking in the chat about Leverage, which I adore Leverage. It's a great show. The real nonlinear narrative episode is The Rashomon Job, which tells the same story 5 times, each revealing new things about how the events went down. And it's only by story number 5 that you actually have all the information to understand what happened.
Yeah.
Like
got
the
a
original
2-minute warning
Rashomon
here.
film.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We were just been given our 2-minute warning, so we have time to wrap up with our final thoughts here. Who would like to jump in with a final? Ada, looked like you were about to say something. Do you want to give us your final thoughts on this concept? Or?
I was just recommending the Rashomon film, which that episode is named after, which does the same structure.
Daniel, any final thoughts to bring to this?
One thing I wanted to say quick when we were talking about, Ada talked a lot about it, telling the audience you're going to kill a character. And one thing I would say not to do is then cheap out on it, right? If you keep telling the audience you're going to kill the character, you better follow through on it. It better not be like a flim flam. It better not be a sleight of hand, because then they're not going to trust you again.
Yep.
Because I've read books that did that, and then I stopped reading that author or that series.
Yeah, you must keep promises.
My final thought for this panel will be 2 words people in the chat are surprised we haven't mentioned so far, which are the words Quentin Tarantino. And for those people who don't want spoilers for Pulp Fiction, it's another reason that you can have a character who dies not be dead at the end of a movie. So you walk in with an entirely different feeling than if we're told chronologically and have bad things happen. So that's a whole different other thing. Arkady, any final things you need to say?
This is really interesting, and there's like a whole other aspect of this that we haven't really talked about that we could spend another whole panel on, which is how unreliability of narrator can influence the ways in which the narrator remembers the story and the way in which that is told. And people have mentioned Memento. There's Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which is like for hipster, but it works for that. A lot of film. It's interesting that this seems to be easier to pull up examples from film than it is from prose.
Yeah. And any quick final thought, Nick, before the goodbye screen pops up and we're muted and sent off into the void again?
Oh, just stay safe, get vaccinated, everybody.
Yes.
In a linear way. Make sure you get the first dose first and the second dose second.
The first shot.
Well, thanks everybody for coming. Enjoy the rest of Balticon. It was fun being nonlinear. Now we'll have opening statements.
Thanks.
See you all.
Bye, everyone.
Well, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
This was lots of fun.